I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about writing poetry. And once again, I have my guest, Diane Grosse, back to help.
Hi.
Because I don't write very good poetry.
I don't know.
You don't know. She hasn't read any of mine. It's not good. I mentioned a little bit last week that I have difficulty with reading poetry. I also have a lot of difficulty writing poetry. Partially because I can't rhyme stuff. And I know that that's not what poetry is. Okay, I know that now. But when I first started, everybody thinks that that's what it is. So I would try to write these poems. They would be just terrible because my poems were so rudimentary. They were like third grade, like, break and take, and they were just not good. Never mind that I have a really hard time writing short. Everything that I try to write short just turns into something longer. You have trouble with writing long.
Huh. If somebody said 5,000 words, I would try. But I would end it, and then I'd do a word count, and it would be like maybe 1,800. And I thought I had written 6,000 words. Mm-hmm. So
it felt like
my mind can just sew it all up, whatever that is, in a smaller space. Editing is a really scary thing. It's probably why I don't write longer, because you have to edit more, and at least I think you do.
And when you only have 5 lines to edit, there's not much.
I
mean, there is, but there isn't.
But if you're married to those 5 words and somebody said you can only write 4,
how do you lose one? Yeah, that's true.
And that's probably been my biggest thing. I love a certain line, and I will build around that, and sometimes it's just not going to work. And then I've started just taking those lines out and throwing them someplace else. And as a visual, what I'm working on now, which is hopefully like the end of a chapbook kind of thing. Welcome to my world of, usually I write in purple, but for some reason this is the second draft.
Okay.
And it got done in black.
Do you usually write by hand?
Oh, longhand, yeah. and then when it gets to the laptop stage, you're really editing. And that's when I start to look at the lines a lot more. In longhand, it's hard, and you start using all the wrap it this way, wrap it that way. That's when I start typing it in. Okay. And typing it in sometimes just makes the whole thing
Once
blow
you're sure
up.
you have the words down, then you go start typing
the idea.
In to see what you have. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And thesaurus.com or a thesaurus. Actually, I leave my thesaurus right next to me. The best thing in the world.
You had said one of the things that people can do if they're just starting is to go back to the basics. Do you think it's important to kind of learn about the actual forms of poetry so that, like, I've told my viewers, you got to know the rules in order to break them. So it's okay to break the rule, but you need to know why you're breaking it. But does it matter with poetry?
Well, I kind of go from that idea of you kind of have to know what you're doing, and even free form has a form, or used to have a form. If we're just gonna like throw caution to the wind and start saying, so there's this is Jason Schinder, and
which book is it?
I'm sorry, it's called Among Women, but of course one is also in there. There's a reason why it's set up the way it is, and there's a form to it. And that form has to make sense, and it should flow with whatever it is that you're saying. Let yourself do what it is your thought process or your hand is telling you to do, and don't worry about the form right away, which is why, I'm sorry, going back to this, you see all the scratchy and all, because this almost looks like a paragraph. Believe it or not, that's going to turn into a poem.
If we jump ahead a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about structure in stories. Because we just talked about how, like mirror poems, bottom to top, top to bottom. It's a fascinating structure. But we also showed the example in Schinder's book of how it looks a certain way, and you can make poems look like, you said you had one that looked like waves.
Well, I was using an example of, you could write a whole story about the ocean, and sometimes it just comes that the whole look of the poem starts to look like
an ocean.
The ebb and flow.
I also read a poem recently that the author didn't use any punctuation or capitalization. because she wanted it to be like a whisper. And so everything, like lowercase I, lowercase names, everything in it was lowercase, which was interesting because I didn't notice it at first. Like, you know, my editor eye was like, there's no capitals. There's no capitals in this poem.
Period.
But it wasn't until I got to the end and the last word of the poem was silence. And I noticed that, wait, this whole poem has been done quietly, you know, in a way, and everything was very short and compact and quiet. All the words were quiet. She was even very careful not to use loud words, like, you know. And I noticed that at the end,
the poem has a structure of even if it's not being structured, it's a structure. There is a reason why you've done it that way. It's not just a bunch of words jumbled. And yeah.
So how do you get more depth in a poem without making it not make sense anymore? You know what I mean? Like, you know, how do you get it? Because, you know, it happens. You read someone's poem and you get to the end and you go, I have no idea what this was about. Like, I don't know what they're trying to even get me to see. If this wasn't in a book about, you know, nature, I wouldn't know that this was about a whippoorwill. Because I don't even understand what I'm reading. You know, because it's lost all sense of meaning because they were so busy trying to get all of this imagery in there.
Well, if they didn't put the whippoorwill in there or something, I think they lost something in that imagery. To me, that's what poetry is. I would like my poems to be read and reflected on and expanded on and have somebody go, I feel that. I've been there. Somebody I know has been there. That's the way I would like to have my poems read and received. I'm not out there to break a new barrier in, you know, how many of these words can you fit in here, but maybe you're losing something, but that doesn't make that bad poetry. It makes it poetry that I'm not resonating with. There are probably books up here I will never read. Doesn't make them not good books. Maybe it's just not the genre that I'm interested in.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's kind of the way the editing works too, right? Like a lot of times you'll send your books out into the world or your poems out into the world and you can't find somebody who likes it. And you're like, but it's not bad, right? It's not bad. I think this is great. Everybody who reads it thinks it's great. And it just means you haven't found the right person for it yet because it didn't speak to that person and the way it speaks to you. I think sometimes it takes a little bit of a mindset change to think about it a little differently. So a good example is I went to a talk by Shannon Hale, who writes a lot of children's books, but she wrote a series of books called the Princess Academy series. Or the first book is just called the Princess Academy. And in it, she had written songs. They're basically poems. They've never been set to music. There's no music out there for them. However, the only way that she could wrap her mind around writing a poem was to think of it as a song, because that was the only way that she could write it personally. Because when she thought about writing a poem, she froze. Like, I can't write poetry. But when she was like, oh, well, it could be a song, then she was okay with it. Like, to her, that was the gateway to get in and write good poems, you know? But she had to think of them as songs.
But think of it. There are some really good haikus out there. And they're what? Here's the non-math me. 17 syllables? The whole poem has to be 17 syllables. You're playing with words. You have the structure, 575. You want to make it good, you've got to be really careful and pick accordingly. And that's, we were talking about this before, or maybe even last week, that when I'm stuck and I just have nothing, I make myself write a haiku, which I actually wrote for my sister's birthday, and throw it in a text. You try a pantoum, you try a sonnet. You try something structured that makes you. Tankas are good because they're what, 5/7, 5/7/7, gives you a little bit more freedom for words, but you have to say something in that. It's just, you're not just writing, there's a line in the sand, I am not going to cross it. Well, there you go. You can start with it, but what's the end game there?
Yeah. I always have a challenge of things that I say don't, and I think we both agree that the one thing that you don't want to do is allow school or classes or teachers to suck the joy out of poetry for you. Mm-hmm. And I understand that we have to study these poems, especially some of the classics, but there's also a line somewhere where poetry becomes not fun or it doesn't make sense. But it's so easy to get kind of bogged. It's the same way with, I think, any subject. If you're studying it, you can love history and then start taking a history class and be like, whoa, this is getting way too deep. Or
they're boring and they're just reading from a book.
Yeah, exactly.
Anybody. So for poetry, if you don't know where to start, or there's so many ways to get poetry online now. Google poetry journals, I don't know, Nature, Google poetry journals, Southeast. Target yourself if you want and start reading what's out there and see if any of that, is like, oh my gosh, I wish I could write like that, or I never want to write like that. Whether it's a printed journal or an online journal, I know there are people that are going to say there's a big difference and you only want to be in the ones that have a print version. Sure. That makes it a very small group of people, and then there's the big tier of small group of people, and then there's the masses.
I also want to point out that these days it's very difficult to get a book of poetry published. Just
chat
period.
Books.
Getting a chat book published is very hard. You have to be a recognized poet, usually from other sources, before you get your book published, and get recognized that way, and then eventually you can get a whole book published. But yeah, same thing with short stories. Getting an entire book of short stories published, hard. Getting a short story published in a magazine or a journal, a lot easier. Yeah. So that might be where you have to start if you're at that level where you're looking. Just be warned. Publishing an entire book of poetry is going to be hard if you're just starting out.
It hurts for a while, and then you just get a thicker skin and go, yeah, whatever.
So as a special treat to our viewers, yes, we're going to end. But before we do, we talked about books that we liked as kids, or we talked about books that are our favorites. So this is a book called Joyful Noise, Poems for Two Voices by Paul Fleischman. My mother loved this book, so hi Mom, this is for you. She used to read it. We read it all the time because it's a book for two people. It is a fascinating way to do poetry. They do all rhyme, but it is a really interesting way. And I think you said when I showed it to you, you're like, I've never seen anything like this.
Love it.
I haven't either. There's not a lot like this, but this is a fascinating way to do poetry. I have seen some spoken word that's very similar, but we are going to
it's like the mirror. It's like a mirror. These are people who are stretching boundaries, and that's what free verse is. But they're still within a boundary.
Right. So to give you an idea, if you want to see it, this is Book Lice. One of us is going to read one side, one's going to read the other, and we're going to read it together.
And hopefully we
did practice it.
Good job. Okay. So this is Book Lice. I was born in a fine old edition of Schiller.
Well, I started life in a private eye thriller. We're book lice who dwell in these dusty bookshelves.
Later I lodged in Scott's Works, volume 50.
While I passed my youth in an Agatha Christie. We're book lice attached despite contrasting pasts.
One day, while in search of a new place to eat,
he fell down 7 shelves where we happened to meet. We're book lice who chew on the bookbinding glue.
We honeymooned in an old guidebook on Greece.
I miss Conan Doyle. He pined for his Keats. We're book lice, fine mates, despite different tastes.
So we set up our home inside Roget's Thesaurus.
Not far from my mysteries and close to his Horace. We're book lice, adoring despite his loud snoring.
And there we've resided, and there will remain.
He nearby his Shakespeare, I near my Spillane. We're book-loving book lice, plain proof of the fact,
which I'm certain I read in a book some months back,
that opposites often are known to attract. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. We post new writing tips for all kinds of writers every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.